Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Scott Shane, the author of Flee North, A Forgotten Hero, and the Fight for Freedom on Slavery's Borderland. This is his third book, and he has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes when he was with the New York Times. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Shane.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Evan.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. The name Thomas Smallwood, you say, is one of a forgotten American hero, someone who engineered the escapes and the transportation for hundreds of other former slaves. He was not willing, though, to let the slave owners or their runaway slaves be forgotten. In fact, he would write dispatches under a pseudonym saying what had just happened. And also he would name the people involved on both sides of it, slave owner and slave. In fact, you say it was his dispatches where the term Underground Railroad was first used. But when you go to Wikipedia and type in Underground Railroad, his name is not even mentioned anywhere in the entry. Why and how did the name Thomas Smallwood get lost until you found it?
That's a great question because he was an extraordinary person. And I hope that this book will kind of open the field for Smallwood studies. And others will pick up the ball and find out even more about him. But I think the reason he was lost is essentially that he was born in slavery. He bought his freedom by the age of 30. He worked as a shoemaker in Washington, D.C., but was a pretty obscure guy. Started helping people escape. So he was working as a shoemaker by day, helping people escape by night. He's got 4 kids, another one on the way. And somehow he's still finding time to write these dispatches under a pseudonym that he sent off to an Albany paper that were published in an abolitionist paper in Albany, New York. But I think the reason he was lost to history, he was operating essentially a clandestine operation. He was using a pseudonym in his writings. So he never became prominent in that sense. It was really only when the police got onto him and he really had to run for his life that his name, for the first time, and one of the only times, appeared in print. And he worked with a white guy by the name of Charles Torrey. And Torrey, while they were mutually respectful and very friendly with each other, Torrey did, towards the end of his life, take credit for Smallwood's achievements. And as far as I could tell, Torrey in his voluminous writings never credited Smallwood in any way. So, and Smallwood eventually runs to Canada. So he lives and dies in Canada. And I think the combination of all these things, another guy a white guy taking credit for the escapes that Smallwood engineered, the fact that he operated under a pseudonym when he did his writing mostly under a pseudonym, and then that he lived in Canada for the latter part of his life, all those things kind of contribute to the fact that he just never appeared on historians' radar.
They tell you in journalism school not to ask double-parted questions here, but I'm going to do it. How did you stumble on this story? And then the second part of that is, how much searching did you have to do to make sure that, as you say, no other book had been written about him?
Well, this book really goes back about 25 years when I was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun. And I'd been living in Baltimore for a number of years when I discovered that there had been a thriving slave trade operation around Baltimore's Inner Harbor. Anybody who's been to Baltimore probably strolled around the harbor. It's a lovely place. It's near the baseball stadium. People eat meals there, buy ice cream, look at the boats, wander around. And I was just quite shocked when I learned that slave traders had operated for the first half of the 19th century there, shipping thousands of people south from Baltimore, mostly to New Orleans, but to the deep south into the sugar and cotton plantations where the demand for labor was huge. And often these people were separated from their families and never heard from again. Obviously, there was basically no way for families left in Maryland to find out where their loved one had ended up. And so it was really a kind of a death sentence to be sold south. So I was kind of horrified by this. I found that very few people, even in Baltimore, a center of the domestic slave trade, knew about this. And so I wrote a long story for the Baltimore Sun about it in 1999. And I always wanted to return to that subject. So basically, about when the pandemic was getting started, I started looking for a story to tell in that world. And it's tough because almost everybody who was being sold south was illiterate. The slave traders themselves were literate, but hardly literary. They then, leave a lot of journals and correspondence talking about how they felt about what they did. So I had to start sort of enlarging my view. And I had heard about a guy who was an abolitionist who had died in the Maryland penitentiary. And his name was Charles Torrey. I started looking at him. And I noticed in some of the things that were written about Torrey, a black side. Torrey's white New Englander. And, some of the writers who wrote about Torrey mentioned a black sidekick, essentially, named Thomas Smallwood, who had worked with him on these escapes. So I started taking a look at Smallwood, and the deeper I got into the story, the more I realized that though it really is, this was reversed, and it was really Smallwood who was essentially the linchpin and the brains behind these mass escapes they were organizing. And Torrey, while he played a crucial role in many of the escapes, had actually been gone for much of the time that Smallwood was organizing escapes. And then I discovered these letters that Smallwood had sent to the Albany paper. And I thought, also Smallwood is about a dozen years older than Torrey. So I kind of came to feel that it was Torrey who was the sidekick to Smallwood, and Smallwood was the key figure in this, and really an extraordinary figure. So as you say, I started looking around like, what can I find about Thomas Smallwood, And the answer was almost nothing. And in fact, this is sort of an aside, but people have been fooling around with ChatGPT, this AI engine. And so, I don't know, it's probably about a month ago, I just had the thought to ask ChatGPT, who was Thomas Smallwood? And I was flabbergasted that it came back and said, I can find no prominent person by that name. so
that means
anyway,
they were really
more.
disappeared. They were really disappeared if ChatGPT doesn't know.
Absolutely.
I just want to ask you, you mentioned that contrast between the Baltimore of today and the lovely inner harbor that many of us have been to, and the contrast of this awful world of slave trading. Did it just strike you because of how the past just kind of fades away, and those of us who were born after something happened really have to dig deep and find out what has been what sort of ghosts are around us in the spaces we inhabit?
Absolutely. I mean, I think also, we forget the things we want to forget. Something this book to a large degree is about the Underground Railroad, people fleeing north, and about the domestic slave trade, people being sold south to the deep south. And, the Underground Railroad has gotten a lot of attention, movies, books, kids are taught it in elementary school these days. It's sort of an exciting story. And I think perhaps one of the crucial things is that it has a benign role for white people, because there were some white people active in helping Black people escape slavery. Whereas the domestic slave trade was basically obviously a white business run by white men. And it started after 1808, when the African slave trade was banned. It became illegal to import people from Africa, enslaved people from Africa. And it happened to be at the time when Eli Whitney had invented the cotton gin, and the cotton business in the Deep South was just booming. And cotton is a very labor-intensive crop, so they were very, very eager to purchase more slaves to work their plantations. And it happened to coincide with a time when, in the upper South, especially in the mid-Atlantic, where tobacco had been very big, farmers were finding that tobacco had kind of worn out their land, and they were switching into grain, which required far fewer workers. So there was a surplus of labor in the mid-Atlantic and a huge demand in the Deep South, and that led to this awful business of selling people south. If people weren't separated from their family on the initial sale, which might be, for example, on Maryland's Eastern Shore, where there were a lot of enslaved people, the Baltimore slave traders would send their agents around and say, anyone you want to sell. And a husband might be sold away from his wife, children from their parents, siblings from each other, and then they get taken to Baltimore, locked in these private slave jails, or slave pens, they called them, around the harbor. And they'd be kept there until there was a ship headed to New Orleans, and then they'd be put aboard a ship and sent away. And then when they got to New Orleans, they would be sold off, essentially the highest bidder. And so even if, say, a husband and wife made it, were sold together in Maryland and landed in New Orleans together, they might well be sold to different plantations or even different states. So it was a horrible business. But I think the reason, we don't know that much about it is that it was a shameful, ugly thing. Even the slaveholders, the character that I write about was the leading slave trader in Baltimore in the years I'm writing about, a guy named Hope Slatter, with the ironic name of Hope.
I've got questions about him, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, Hope Slatter was always in search of respectability and couldn't get respect even from the slaveholders he did business with. And I think it's just that kind of human psychology where, the slaveholders probably knew at some level what they were doing was terribly wrong. And they needed somebody who was doing something worse. So the slaveholders looked down on the slave traders. And no one wanted to tell this story. So basically, it's rarely been told.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Piece together, if you can, Thomas Smallwood's early life. A lot of what we know seems to come from his autobiography, and I'm especially fascinated with how he learned to read and write in the first place. He was really born into unusual circumstances for a slave.
He was, and I think he would be the first to say, and he does essentially acknowledge this in his short memoir autobiography, that it was really his good fortune. Randomly, he was inherited along with his sister as a kid by a woman in Maryland, who then married a second marriage for both of them, married a minister, a preacher named John Ferguson, just outside D.C. in Bladensburg, Maryland. And Ferguson was basically, he wasn't an abolitionist, but he was pretty hostile to slavery. But it was a complicated legal situation because apparently Thomas Smallwood and his sister had been inherited not only by John Ferguson's new wife, but also by her children from an earlier marriage. And it wasn't within his power to free them. And anyway, he worked out a deal where he paid his wife and her kids, and then asked Smallwood to pay him back over time. And so they made a deal, or he offered him a deal at 15, when Smallwood was 15, that at 30 he would free him, and that he would try to pay the $500 that he paid for him, pay Ferguson back that money. So that put him on the road to eventual freedom. And Ferguson and his wife taught him to read and write, at least the basics. And in fact, Smallwood talks about how as a black boy, at an early age, he was almost, sort of viewed by the neighbors as a prodigy because he could spell words, he says, in 2 syllables. And that was kind of a rare feature for a black kid. Anyway, so that's how he got his start in terms of literacy. He never, as far as I can tell, he never went to school a day in his life. But then later he was, something that was very common in those days were for the enslaved to be hired out to work somewhere else. And then usually the slaveholder would collect the wages. And anyway, Thomas Smallwood went to work as a servant, a household servant, in a family of a schoolmaster in Washington, D.C. And this guy was a kind of a colorful guy who ran a whole series of schools and had older children at home. And Smallwood says that this fellow, whose name was John McLeod, and his children all took a hand in trying to further Smallwood's education. As far as I can tell, Smallwood never attended any formal classes in any of his boss's schools. And probably as a black young man, he would not have been welcome. But at home, he seems to have been exposed to a lot of literature and encouraged to expand his learning. So one way or another through all of this, and he must have just been a voracious reader, and he must have had an enormous appetite for learning, because by the time he's in his 30s, he is a very well-educated guy. And, one of the things that I think is a very interesting moment is he's living in DC, he's working as a shoemaker. So it's a blue collar job, so to speak. But he meets up with this guy, Charles Torrey, who has come down from Massachusetts. And Torrey has gone to Andover and Yale. So he kind of has the best education America had to offer at the time. But I think Smallwood kind of met him on his own terms because, Smallwood in his writings throws around literary allusions, big fan of Charles Dickens. And in general, he just really seems to have done a tremendous job of educating himself.
I realize you're not necessarily a historian or a political historian, but I do want to ask, just to set this up a little bit, where was the anti-slavery movement in the 1840s? And I guess that's also a way of asking how the system was set up to protect slavery. How was that faring at the time as well?
Well, so the anti-slavery movement really kind of took off in the 1830s. There had obviously always been opponents of slavery, some of them organized. But in the 1830s, abolition societies began to pop up in towns across the North. And they became very popular. Abolitionist newspapers began to draw a wide readership. And, slavery had gradually been abolished in the northern states. So you had this very bifurcated country now. But I would say that in the 1830s and into the 1840s, the abolitionist movement was very oriented towards talk. There were a lot of meetings, there were a lot of writings, but most of the people doing the writing and talking were Northerners, most of them in New England, and they had very little or no contact with people living in slavery or with slaveholders, for that matter. And so there was, I think it was a sort of, at times, a self-indulgent movement, is my impression. They were certainly on the right side of history, but there was a certain amount of kind of moral preening and just, I'm a great guy because I hate slavery, and I'm sitting up here in Boston, living a good life and not taking any risks.
At the time, how aware were people, or were people at all aware that slavery would have 2 more decades to go on in this country? Was there a feeling that it was close to being over, or that it could stretch another 100 years?
I think it would certainly depend on who you asked. The leading abolitionists, the big name in abolitionism in the 1830s and 40s was William Lloyd Garrison, who was a fiery speaker from Massachusetts, but he had a somewhat strange, I would say, in retrospect, view of how to go about the abolition of slavery. He thought the government and the political system were too corrupted by slavery and by what they called the slave power to use against slavery. So he was very much against sort of acting politically against slavery or to advance the cause of abolition. And indeed, he didn't even vote because he thought that would be sort of corrupting. And Charles Torrey, one of the guys that I'm writing about, was one of those who broke with Garrison because they said you really have to use the political system. And they started something called the Liberty Party, a political party, national political party to oppose slavery. But I think, for a while there was a feeling, I would say more in the 1820s and 1830s, that there was a theory that slavery might die out on its own. But I think one of the things that gave it new life was, in fact, the invention of the cotton gin and the boom in the production of cotton, the export of cotton, huge American export to Europe. And that was also, I think, combined with this source of labor that was discovered in the Upper South, in slave states where there was a labor surplus. And those, I often think if you read about the early 19th century, there were a lot of people being freed from slavery by slaveholders in Maryland. And the reason was they didn't need their labor anymore and they didn't want to feed them. And so they would go and fill out the manumission papers, as they were called, and say, go, you're free now. But what changed was this domestic slave trade. Suddenly, instead of just letting someone go, freeing them, you could sell them for $500, $800, $1,000, which was, roughly $1,000 would have been somewhere around $30,000, $35,000 in our money. So if you were going to, if you could sell a handful of slaves and have the equivalent of $100,000. So, obviously this made it very less popular, shall we say, to free an enslaved worker who you no longer needed. And, it was completely taken over by the trade. And I think all of that kept slavery going for a much longer time. The other thing that I guess I should mention is that as the abolitionists wrote and denounced slavery as an abomination, as something that was, violated the principles of Christianity and so on, Southerners who were slaveholders shifted from treating slavery as a sort of necessary evil and began to make the argument that it was a positive good. And it's hard to believe, but you can go back and find tracts that were written that say that the Southern slave society, the first half of the 19th century, was the ideal arrangement of a society, that there had to be an enslaved group to support, a sort of polite society, prosperous society, and that this was, that basically this was doing a favor for the enslaved Africans, and that this was not a necessary evil, but the way we should organize American society across the board. So people became polarized, and there were huge financial stakes, obviously, in slavery, and so it went on and on.
I'm really curious about this. I love interviewing other reporters on this show. We've certainly done so a number of times. How does being a reporter prepare one to write books?
Well, I guess if you're used to writing 1,000 words or 2,000 words, eventually you come onto a subject where you want to write 5,000 words, and your editor says, no, cut this to 2,000. And
that's me every day, by the way. But yeah,
there you go. Yeah. So you get a little frustrated, and you want the freedom to really explore something in detail and to tell a longer story. And so I was a Moscow correspondent in the Gorbachev years, essentially the last years of Soviet power, of Soviet Union. So I wrote a book about that. Later on, I covered terrorism and counterterrorism for years, and I wrote a book about an American terrorist who also then became the first American citizen to be deliberately killed in a U.S. drone strike. So these were all spun out of my work as a reporter. But as I mentioned, I had come across the slave trade and gotten very interested in the subject. So this was something different. Obviously, the big difference about writing about people in the 1840s is you can't call them up and say, hey, I'm writing about you. Could I come over and, could we spend a couple hours together? And also another thing is, often in contemporary reporting, there's a document out there and you really want the document and you try to get the document, whatever it is. And that can be kind of the key to breaking news or getting a story written. In this case, all the documents in the 1840s, there's a sort of finite number. And it may be that the document that you really want to find just does not exist on the face of the earth. So that's something that you have to get used to. I think the big overlap, though, is, I guess I'm used to telling stories. I'm used to digesting a lot of material and finding a story in that material. And I'm used to looking for new stuff, surprising stuff in documents. And these documents just happen to be very old documents. But I spent a lot of time reading the newspapers from the 1840s.
There are a lot of authors who we interview on this show whose books neatly flow into one another. Some of them are geographical, some of them are by time period, some of them are by person, some of them are by subject. You have written a book about the end of the Soviet Union and your views of watching that and what it was like. You've written a book, as you said, about the first American targeted in an airstrike, in a drone airstrike. And then you've written a book about a guy in the 1840s who helped create the Underground Railroad. Is there any flow? Is there anything you can sort of deduce about how this all went down in your mind? Or are they just totally separate things and you said this would be a good project now? Or is there something beneath the surface here that bubbled up each time?
It's funny that you should ask that. Occasionally I ask myself that. It's like, how did this happen? But I think if there's a common thread, I've often been drawn to sort of big stories or stories within a bigger story. I like to find the characters and the action to tell, I guess, a smaller story that's a microcosm of a big story. And the big stories that I'm drawn to seem to involve big moral issues. So the Soviet Union was an experiment, starting in 1917, to find a way where people could be more equal, people could be happier theoretically. That was at least the concept. They tried it for 70 or so years, and I think it's fair to say failed pretty miserably, but it was still a sort of, it was so different from American life. It was a totalitarian society, and then it began to fall apart in the 80s, but it was it was still sort of the big questions about human life. Again, the book I wrote about terrorism follows, first tries to answer the question, how does a person become a terrorist? And this guy was a particularly interesting case because he was an American citizen. He was a very successful imam, a Muslim cleric, and he then joins Al-Qaeda and becomes a leading figure in Al-Qaeda. So there's that question. And then there was a question of how does a president of the United States, in this case, Barack Obama, decide this guy is so dangerous and it's so difficult to catch him that we will just try to kill him without criminal charges, without a trial, without a conviction, without a sentence. And that happens. And so again, you have these very big sort of moral questions about the moral challenge posed by terrorism and how you meet it. And I guess, obviously, in the 19th century, slavery in American history is, the overwhelming dominant issue. And it divides the country. It leads to the Civil War. And, in many ways, as we've, I think, come to learn more recently, with sort of better, more thoughtful, more objective histories, slavery in a sense did not end after the Civil War. It was just sort of recodified as Jim Crow, eventually as mass incarceration, and went on for much of my lifetime. So it's something that's always disturbed me and something I wanted to know more about. And so I guess there is a little bit of a thread there, but I guess readers can decide.
All right, back to Mr. Smallwood.
Yes.
How did he develop this network? As you say, he bought his freedom. He's around, I think, 30 or 31, right? 30, yeah. 31. He's about 30 years old. How does he say, not only have I freed myself, but I can help free others?
Well, I'm not sure that he organized any escapes himself in the 1830s. It's not entirely clear. He actually credits the arrival of this guy from the North, Charles Torrey, and their conversations with sort of lighting the fire. And so at least on a large scale, it appears to have begun in 1842. And, he had a particularly valuable contact in Baltimore, a Black guy named Jacob Gibbs, who was a house painter and plasterer. And he became sort of the critical part of Smallwood's network north of Washington. And Smallwood doesn't really explain, perhaps for obvious reasons, because he wrote his memoir in 1851 when it was still under slavery. And anyone who was operating in the Underground Railroad, anyone who was helping people escape, was violating the law and was in danger of going to prison. So he doesn't elaborate on the network, but you pick up bits and pieces here and there. And certainly this guy, Jacob Gibbs in Baltimore, was key. He talks about using a safe house about a day's or night's, really, a night's travel from Washington. So that would probably have been either Jacob Gibbs' house or some safe house that they had identified near Baltimore. Then there'd be another trip from Baltimore north, and they could often reach somewhere near the Susquehanna River, big broad river that part of it goes along the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania, part of it's in Maryland. But it's, once you reach the Susquehanna, you're approaching Pennsylvania. So if they could get across, usually the third night, they would get into Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania cross the Mason-Dixon line is a free state, and you're not safe if you're fleeing slavery and you get to Pennsylvania, because especially the southern Pennsylvania, the border area there, was crawling with slave catchers, bounty hunters, police from Washington, Baltimore, looking for runaway slaves. And so you weren't entirely safe, certainly, but you were much safer, and you had reached a free state. And so, and he does talk about working with the Quakers in southern Pennsylvania, handing people over to the Quakers, who would, in most cases, get them to Philadelphia, where there was a strong abolitionist community. And after that, these guys actually, I mean, sometimes you think of the Underground Railroad, you think people running through the woods. And there was a lot of that south of the Mason-Dixon line, but it appears that most of the folks Smallwood and Torrey were helping would get to Philly and then travel north on public transportation, on steamboats, on railroads. And so part of what Smallwood and Torrey were doing was raising the money to send these people north.
How does he start to use the media to engineer this sort of, this sort of mocking tone that he takes towards slavery? And what was his strategy behind that?
Well, what happens is this guy, Charles Torrey, has come to Washington as the correspondent to cover Washington, to cover Congress, basically, for a bunch of little abolitionist newspapers in the North. And one of them is in Albany, New York, and it's called Tocsin of Liberty. Tocsin's an old word. I love
the way it's spelled, by the way, Tocsi.
Well, and that's because it's an old word that means bell. So it's basically Liberty Bell. And so Tocsin of Liberty is this small abolitionist paper. And they had a couple of people writing for them who were writing in a satirical fashion about slavery and about escapes from slavery. And so that may have been an influence on Smallwood, but somehow in 1842, he just takes up his pen and starts writing about these escapes. He doesn't give the details of the method of escape, which would have been, bad operational security and might have endangered future escapes. But he names the people who are doing the escaping, gives their full names. He names their enslavers. He sometimes gives little anecdotes about how they got away. He often addresses these letters to the slaveholders, sometimes offering them mock sympathy for the loss of their beloved servants and reassurance that they're now, as he likes to say sometimes, north of the Great Ontario, meaning Lake Ontario. So they're in Canada, in the British Empire, where there's slavery's been banned, and basically they're out of your reach. But he also would sort of ennoble or celebrate the enslaved who were escaping. And sort of, he kind of turns the table on the whole portrayal by Southern slaveholders of the institution of slavery. Southern slaveholders generally saw themselves as benign, paternalistic, helpers who were helping these poor people who had come from Africa, whose parents had come from Africa, and who were incapable of, living in a society like America. And so, they were being looked out for. So they were the smart ones, and the enslaved were, of course, the intellectually, incapable ones. Well, Smallwood just turns this on its head, and he treats the slaveholders as essentially a bunch of morons, very slow-witted, and the enslaved as quick-witted and easily able to escape from the slow-witted slaveholders. So basically, these letters they're clearly very influenced by Charles Dickens, and they become these kind of mockery fests in which the slaveholders and the slave catchers these police and bounty hunters who make a lot of their money from catching runaways, that they are the dumb ones. They're the ones to be pitied. Sometimes he also exposes some of their perfidy. He talks about slaveholders who are raping their enslaved women. He talks about violence used against slaves. But he lays it all out there in these dispatches, which he somehow was writing, presumably in the middle of the night, and sending off to Albany every week or two.
But the goal here is to embarrass them, right? And basically take the system down from the inside out.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that he asked the editors of the paper, Toxin of Liberty, in Albany to do was to mail a copy of the paper to any slaveholder who was named. And so these guys would get this obscure paper from Albany, open it up, and see themselves held up to public ridicule, and basically have nothing they could do about it. And the idea, though, at a larger level, he wasn't just having fun at their expense, though that was a big part of it. He was hoping to demoralize, to sort of destroy the belief of the slaveholders in the system, and to convince them, if you lost, if you had 5 or 6 slaves and they all fled and you didn't get them back, that was enormous. That was your capital. That was your wealth that had just disappeared overnight. And that was a shocking blow to the slaveholder. So by having these people disappear, and I should say, one of the things they were doing was trying to always work by the wagon load. So 10 people, 15 people, sometimes as many as 20 people, men, women, and children, would be packed into a wagon, a covered wagon, and would sail off in the middle of the night. And so it was an enormous loss. And having been through that experience, some of the slaveholders, according to what Smallwood heard on the grapevine, and sometimes literally overheard while hanging out in Washington, D.C., some of these people would say, I'm not going to buy any more slaves. I'm going to hire some people, because they just couldn't afford to pay a lot of money for new workers and then have them flee north. And so the hope was that you could kind of collapse the system from inside by demoralizing the slaveholders.
Who was Hope Slatter or Slater? Slatter.
Slatter.
Who was Hope Slatter, and how did he engineer the pushback to Smallwood's efforts?
Slatter was the leading slave trader in the domestic slave trade in the mid-Atlantic for going on 10 years, about 10 years, late 1830s to late 1840s. And he operated from Baltimore, but he had a network of agents who sort of fanned out across Maryland and into D.C., and they would purchase unneeded, unwanted slaves from farms and plantations, and sometimes city dwellers, and bring them to this slave jail right on Pratt Street, which is the street that runs along Baltimore's Inner Harbor. And he had actually worked as a young man. He was from Georgia. He'd worked as a young man as a sheriff, a small town sheriff. And the sheriff in a small town in those days was often involved in overseeing the sale of an estate, for example, and often the estate would include a bunch of enslaved people. And so from early on, he was sort of introduced to the idea of buying and selling slaves. And so Slatter got his start, as many slave traders did in those days, in the 1830s, operating out of Charleston, South Carolina, Fayetteville, North Carolina, other places, in hotels. So he would sort of move into a hotel, usually operating at the bar, believe it or not, and just meeting people at the bar and saying, hey, you got anyone you want to sell? And then he would take them, farther south and sell for a profit, resell them for a profit. Then he kind of made it into the big time because Baltimore was a very busy port in the domestic slave trade. And so he moves there. First, he operates from hotels in the same way in the late 1830s. Then he builds a house for himself and his family and a so-called slave jail, a big brick building with quarters for men and quarters for women and a lot of bars and a kind of open courtyard. And he starts operating from there and is extremely successful, makes a fortune. What was, sort of surprising perhaps was the sort of psychology that you get from the many accounts of Hope Slatter. He didn't leave any journal that I'm aware of that I've been able to find. I don't think any of his correspondence has been saved, but he was often visited, including by abolitionists, by people who, hostile to slavery, and who would come south. And Baltimore was a place, it was the largest city in the slave South. It was the most northern city in the slave South, so it was accessible. And he tried to essentially welcome many of these abolitionists who wanted to see the slave trade. And he would try to make the case that these people were treated well, and it's a grim business, but somebody has to do it. And he'd try to portray himself as, basically a good guy in what he admitted was sort of an ugly business. It was not very effective usually, but these abolitionists would go back and record what he said and their experience of his slave jail. But what you find as a recurring theme is this quest for respectability. And at one point, Hope Slatter buys a pew in a brand new Methodist church in downtown Baltimore that was apparently a big deal at the time. And to buy a pew was a way, you'd buy it in advance, and it was a way of financing the construction of the church. But it's a Methodist church, and, I found in the newspaper the fact that the family that had bought the pew behind Hope Slatter were so appalled by the idea of a slave trader coming to church that they said they would not occupy that pew as long as he was there. So he couldn't get a break. And when he finally essentially retires from the business in Baltimore, he first moves to Richmond, but still apparently couldn't find his acceptance there. And so he ends up in Mobile, Alabama. And there he seems to have been accepted, but he leaves the slave trade and buys up a whole lot of downtown Mobile with the earnings that his huge profits from the slave trade.
What was Smallwood's fate? Ultimately, it just gets too difficult to keep doing this and keep engineering some of these escapes. And so he has to move to Canada, and people basically say, you got to get out of Dodge, buddy. You're barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of his strengths as in both as a clandestine operator and as a writer, the writer of these newspaper dispatches, is that as a black man, as a free black man in Washington, D.C., he had a certain invisibility. The white people kind of ignored the black people, and so they would often talk in front of him. He would be at the market, he'd be at the train depot, he'd be somewhere in a public place, and he'd overhear these people who were his neighbors. Washington was a pretty small town. But then he's writing these letters that are about his neighbors and about how he has helped their enslaved workers disappear. And, inevitably, the question arises, who's writing this stuff? Who's helping these people escape? And eventually the police begin to get wind of this, of the fact that Smallwood is involved. And, he and Torrey lures him. He actually gets to Toronto. He first does a sort of trip on his own to check out Toronto and see if he could move his family there as things get hot in Washington D.C. and Baltimore, and he decides that's a possibility. Then he gets his family up there, but Tory talks him into coming south one more time, and it ends badly. They both take off running, and Smallwood basically makes this extremely dramatic sort of hairbreadth escape, and eventually gets back to his family in Toronto, where he's settled.
What was the impact of the Underground Railroad on the people who escape themselves? A lot of them wind up north of the border. How do we feel it today?
I mean, there was a dispute in the abolition community, among the abolitionists, as to whether to encourage people who were fleeing slavery to stop in the northern United States and sort of join the cause of abolition. Some became lecturers, Frederick Douglass obviously being the most famous, but stayed to kind of fight the good fight. But that also, in many cases, put them in danger of being essentially kidnapped and taken south again, either sold back into slavery, or returned to their original enslaver. And so Smallwood was always a guy who advised people to keep running until they reached Canada, because there was an international border there, and pretty much if you crossed that border, you were safe from all these slave catchers and slave catching police. The Underground Railroad had an enormous impact on the lives of people who fled because, they were free. And when you read there's a guy who went around and collected the sort of observations and experiences of a lot of the people who fled slavery and ended up in Canada. And you find again and again, life is not easy in Canada. It's friggin' cold up here. But I'm free, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. And so the Underground Railroad changed enormous numbers of individual lives. And I think that was, Smallwood and Tory were both kind of tired, I think, of all the abolitionist talk and wanted to do something. And so they, very dramatically changed the lives of the people who they directly helped. I think most historians would also say that the Underground Railroad further polarized America. The abolitionists were seen as essentially, not much better than thieves, helping steal the, human property of the southern slaveholders. And so, there was a lot of bitterness about it. And of course, in 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which essentially said to Northerners, you're obligated under the law now to help return escaped slaves to the South. People did not like that. So it heated up the temperature, you could say, politically in the decades before the Civil War, and maybe increased the fact that the Civil War eventually became inevitable.
I caught the reference in the book, for Francie, my whole-souled partner in all things. What is it like for her to be wholly sold, invested in a fiance's book project?
Well,
it's the dedication, by the way. I love asking authors about their dedications.
It is. Francie Weeks is my wife of many years, and whole souled I stole actually from Smallwood, who applies that to Charles Tory. And so I just, borrowed that phrase. But she, to put up with an author writing a book is not easy. And she's done it 3 times. And she got somewhat involved in some of the research for this. We went together to, among other things, try and find the graves of all 3 of these characters. So we went to...
That was actually my next question. Had you been to Smallwood's grave in Toronto?
Yeah, so we went to Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Mass, where Charles Torrey was buried, and there's a kind of a very fancy obelisk with a portrait, sort of a sculpted portrait of Torrey, some quotations. It's now surrounded by flowers. It's quite a beautiful grave and quite an impressive one. We went down to Mobile, where Hope Slatter retired from the slave trade, and his grave is a giant kind of marble tomb, a giant block, white. It glistens in the distance. It's about the biggest grave in Magnolia Cemetery in Mobile. It's surrounded by a gold-painted fence, very fancy kind of thing, as befits a guy who'd made a fortune in the slave trade. Then we went to Toronto, and we knew that Smallwood and several family members were buried in the Toronto necropolis, which is the old.
What a name that is! Boy,
yeah, what a name, huh?
Brutal.
It's actually a lovely green cemetery with lots of big old trees, and we had the plot essentially that it was like I-125 or something. You could tell more or less where the grave was, and we searched all over the place and found there was nothing, no stone with Smallwood's name on it. And so I talked to the folks who run that cemetery, and they said that there had been a survey done in the 80s, and they recorded every visible headstone, and Smallwood was not recorded there either. And they said that basically, and we could see this happening on our visit actually, especially if it's not a tall headstone, if it's the kind that lies along the ground, eventually the grass just grows over it, and it sinks into the earth. So the only thing that I can think is that Smallwood, who was quite successful in Toronto, he started a saw factory making hand saws and wood saws, and he was the kind of guy who probably would have purchased a headstone for himself and family members who died. So I suspect they're under there somewhere, but I, it was sort of melancholy in a way that this guy who had risked his life for the freedom of a lot of people and had really achieved something as a literary stylist as well, had just been erased. And it sort of seemed to be symbolized by the fact that you could go to the graveyard where he's buried and you can't find any sign of his having lived. I hope maybe, one impact of telling his story might be that folks in Washington, D.C., which was basically his hometown and where he did this heroic work, and maybe folks in Canada, where he spent actually the last 40 years of his life, he lived into his 80s, might, see fit to build some kind of a plaque or memorial for this guy.
How many people did he free ultimately? I mean, you say hundreds, it's hard to tell.
It is hard to tell. Charles Torrey said at the end of his life that he had freed 400 people. And it's an interesting number because it's definitely not true of Torrey alone. Torrey, in the middle of this story, becomes the editor of that Albany paper that Smallwood was publishing in. So he's not in town. He's not organizing escapes. But I do think if you sort of do the math and you look at some of the numbers of people arriving in Albany, which was a stop on their way north, it's realistic that as many as 400 were freed by Smallwood and Torrey together.
How would you design a memorial to him? What would it look like?
My gosh. I have not been able to find an image of Thomas Smallwood, but I guess I could say I haven't given up. I would love to see what this guy looked like, and I would love to see a statue of him, maybe in D.C., maybe in the neighborhood in Southeast D.C. where he lived for many years and where he organized this work. It's right near the Navy Yard, which was there in the 1840s and is still there today, sort of right off the Anacostia River. And, I would put a big statue right there.
Two quick ones for you. Have you decided what's next?
No, I really haven't. I have half a dozen book ideas that have been churning around away for years. And, at some point, after this one, recedes a little bit, I gotta get out, and I'd love to get out and talk about this one for a while. But then I'll look at the possibilities, and they always say sell enough books that you can talk a publisher into publishing the next one. So that's my hope.
And lastly, I'm not sure if you're an Orioles fan, but I'm going to take a stab at it. Are the Orioles going to do it this year?
I think they might. Well, it's funny because last time the Orioles won the World Series was 1983.
Year I was born.
Okay, there you go. Well, it happened to be coincide almost exactly with the birth of my eldest child, Martha Shane. She's about to turn 40, and it's about time, Orioles, but they're looking good. So who knows?
I'll welcome Martha to the club. June for me. Scott Shane, the author of Flee North, A Forgotten Hero and the Fight for Freedom in Slavery's Borderland. Thanks so much for being here, Scott.
It was a real pleasure. Thanks, Evan.
Check out the book. Check out his website, scottshane.org. He's on the website, formerly known as Twitter, @ScottShaneNYT. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @AxelBankHistory. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.